Welcome back, everybody, to another edition of Voices Interviews, where we interview authors from our latest edition of Voices, Volume 20, Number 3. Today I'm pleased to interview the author of But Where Are You Really From? Approaching Music Therapy Research and Practice as an Australian of Indian Origin by Tanya Silveira. Tanya is a music therapy researcher in stroke rehabilitation, completing her PhD at the University of Melbourne. She discusses tonight her complex intersectional identities and how it has impacted her journey as an advocate in stroke rehab, as a music therapy researcher. She positions herself as an Australian of Indian origin, and she'll share her personal reflections about her journey, highlighting the importance of visibility and change in music therapy research and practice. Welcome, and thank you
Thank
for
you.
being here. And, if you'd like to start off with, as your article has started off with the land acknowledgement, because it plays a central role in how and framing where you go with your article.
I'm based in Sydney, Australia, and I currently reside on the lands of the Bidjigal, Gawajal, and Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and it's really important and I guess significant to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge sovereignty was never ceded because as an Australian of Indian origin, our family has greatly benefited from being on this land. So, also extending my acknowledgement and my gratitude to any Indigenous people listening to this interview as well.
And as we talk about your article in Voices, there's so many. You talk about intersectional theory related to it, and just even within the identities that you present within the articles: PhD student, music therapist, advocate, nationality, Indian, Australian. Um, you know, I would just like to start off. Where would you like to start off? Where would you like to? Where would you like to go as we go through this journey, talking about your article? What feels most relevant for you as you think about this work?
Yeah, well, actually, just as you were just speaking, I had this kind of momentary flashback. I'm in my little home office, and behind my computer, there's just some space, like a bit of a carpet. And I guess I just thought about the moment where I decided to write something and write this article. So maybe I can start there and share a bit of that
Yeah,
journey and be, I'm big on being transparent and bringing my most authentic self and being vulnerable in the process, which I find very challenging in academia, but I'm
absolutely.
trying to do more and more of that.
Hmm.
But I remember, just being fixated on the reignited Black Lives Matter movement and deeply considering that in the Australian context as well, in relation to our First Nations people. And then also on another level, thinking about that in relation to myself. And I couldn't really understand or figure out why I was deeply impacted by it, because I just kept thinking I'm not a First Nations person, I'm not a Black person, especially in that context of America. I'm in this country of Australia, and my parents came here for a better life. I'm a first generation migrant and the firstborn of my whole family actually on this land. And I feel like I've had such a privileged life. So I was really confused, and I didn't know what to do with all these kind of emotions. And as I guess the academic side of me wanted to understand and figure it out. So I sat on my carpet and I had these massive sheets of paper out, like as tall as me, really. And I started mind mapping and I started writing just some things that were coming to mind. And a word that kept coming up was overlooked. And and then I realized that that was in relation to myself, and then thinking about that in relation to my family coming to this country. And that's kind of where it started. So I started writing all of this stuff, and then I went to my computer and started typing as a kind of journal article, not so much as a like journal as in journaling for myself. Not,
Right.
I never
Hmm.
thought I'd ever share this with the world, um, like a diary entry, really. And then as I kind of went on and made these discoveries, and even deeply considered the impact of access to healthcare in relation to my grandparents, one who had passed away in Australia and one who had passed away in India before I was born. I started thinking about longevity of life, and then I started thinking about um, if they had had that access, what that would that have, had an implication on their lifespan. And then I just cried and cried and cried, and it was so cathartic, this kind of realization, and then coming full circle, and then realizing that this, yeah, this the my I suppose limited understanding of intersectionality, because it's not my area of research, but in just wanting to learn more about it, I realized that my research in stroke rehab and my motivations was deeply embedded within me, in my unconscious, self, which was so cathartic and so emotional, but also very centering, I suppose. So yeah, it
Wow.
was big.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Yeah. And such an important personal reflexivity happening
Mm.
in relation to so much of the work that you're currently doing. But I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about just your work in general in stroke rehab. What is your research currently as a PhD student? And yeah, talk about some of your work in that area.
Yeah, so my current research as a PhD student is in upper limb rehabilitation and well-being. So specifically working with stroke survivors who have basically no movement in their upper limb. So that's the arm and the hand. Um, and I, I guess my passion and my focus in this subset of stroke survivors is because when you look at the medical system, unfortunately, they generally get overlooked by the system because their movement is so limited or seemingly non-existent. I'm specifically using the word seemingly because you've just got to make things accessible for people to be able to see what's there and to see what their potential is and what they can do, rather than just saying no, there doesn't seem to be potential, so there mustn't be potential, which unfortunately is something that happens all over the world. So as as part of my clinical work, I wanted to find a way to somehow promote movement, and I was so lucky to work with an incredible stroke and neuro coordinator at my job at the time, who introduced me to something called FES, or functional electrical stimulation. And basically, it's very safe. It sounds a bit intense, but it's quite safe. And basically, it stimulates the muscle groups, and the areas that have been, I guess, the pathways that have seemed to have been lost due to the stroke, and it stimulates them and sends a message back up to the brain, which influences that motor return of the hand, which is pretty cool. And I wanted to find, yeah, it's so cool, and very safe, and there's a lot of research about it, so it's been around for a while. But while the stroke survivors use that machine, they need to do like functional tasks. And I'm saying functional because a lot of stroke survivors I've worked with have said that, watching themselves lift and lower a finger isn't like that much fun, or try to tip over a plastic cup isn't that much fun. And those are the kinds of tasks. So I combined it with an iPad based app called Thumb Jam, where, iPads are so accessible and it's super touch sensitive that whilst they're engaged with this machine, they're actually making music and, finding their strengths by exploring sound and whilst they're making music, of course, they're engaging in, non-verbal processing and non-verbal expression, through the music. And we, as music therapists, we generally know what impact and positive impact that has on our mental health and our well-being. So combining the two together, it's just, I find it quite exciting, because not only I'm not separating music therapy from the occupational therapy or physiotherapy that the machine is centered in. I'm saying that when we all kind of unite and we collaborate, it can be really amazing, which I think, now saying this out loud, it kind of feels like a metaphor for life, doesn't it?
I was just gonna say that. Yeah, absolutely. Wow, that's so interesting. Lots of different areas coming together: technology, rehab, working cross-disciplinary, work that you're doing. Wow, it's really, really amazing. The process of doing your work in circ rehab with your PhD as well. The impetus for this article comes from some of the direct experiences you've had in both settings and just in daily life in general as well, with the assumptions, the microaggressions, the advocacy that you've been doing. I was wondering, if you could talk a little bit about, some of the areas that you talked about in the article in relation to what, therapists of color or therapists who, maybe have hidden disabilities and other disabilities as well, may experience on a daily basis some of the racist, ableist, microaggressive stereotyping that happens, and talk about perhaps how some of those experiences you wrote about and has influenced your work and your understanding of your own identity.
Yeah. Well, I guess there's another point of reflection, which might, you know, I guess it might give more context to my push to write and put out this kind of an article so quickly, almost without even thinking, just send it across and just get it out into the world as soon as I could. Part of that came from my volunteer role as the Australian Music Therapy Association's conference convener for 2020. So I felt very fortunate to have been asked to do this role. I wasn't sure about it because of my commitments with PhD and all of that kind of stuff. And then, of course, we ended up having to take the conference online, which ended up being, such an incredible experience. But trying to convene a national conference which had international outreach whilst doing my PhD, whilst just trying to keep my emotions, in check while still process them.
Goodness gracious.
And it was a lot to hold. Of course I consistently have clinical supervision and I have a great support network and have a wonderful now fiance actually and beautiful family that I can reflect upon these things with. But I think that context is important because I've always been a believer, and I think this is a lot comes from my mum. I've been a believer in, if you're given a platform to be heard, you need to speak your truth and you need to advocate for others. So that was a huge drive for me to get this article going and actually reflect quite deeply upon my adverse experiences. And I shared a lot of those specific adverse experiences with our PhD cohort in a presentation online, just to just to share, these are some of the things that I have experienced and this is where I am, and we're all kind of doing doing a PhD or masters by research together, but these are the things that I'm sitting with as well that perhaps you're not sitting with or you haven't had to think about. So kind of thinking about all of those, an amalgamation of everything kind of coming to a point last year, and with the conference kind of approaching, having the most incredible scientific chair, Dr. Ellie Scrine, who is such an incredible advocate. And, I spent a lot of time talking to Ellie about my own experiences and processing my own experiences. It just felt necessary to be vulnerable and to speak my truth. So, I guess that context is just, if I wasn't conference convener, I don't know if I would have, written this as quickly, or I wouldn't have, perhaps the style of writing it, it would have been different. When the first draft of me writing it was me articulating specific adverse experiences of when I've been overlooked, and the specific detail of what that did to my confidence and to my self-esteem, within a professional context and within a personal context, even going back, when I was a kid. But just thinking about, having a role in leadership and essentially a position of power, being a conference convener, I decided that the most appropriate angle was to encourage people to see what their strengths are as therapists and make changes in knowing what other people, or getting a sense of what other people such as myself experience. Just as music therapists, we predominantly work in a strengths-based approach to working with people. We want to draw upon their strengths so to help them with their rehabilitation or their therapeutic growth or development, however you articulate it. And so I guess I took a lot of that kind of specific stuff out to make sure that people who didn't have similar adverse experiences to me did not feel overwhelmed, which I know I don't need to do that, but I chose to. And another reason is because I had had conversations with people who identify as white, whose responses would be like, I can't hear that, Tanya, that's so intense. Like, oh, please stop talking about it, when I'm talking about racist encounters that I've had. So I just had to kind of meet in the middle somewhere, and maybe down the track I will articulate in writing some of those things. But I guess an example is just being asked, what language I speak, or, some of the things that I've articulated in the article, or even being overlooked. This happened, this happened as a teenager, as a child, and it's happened even recently, even a couple of years ago. Even last year, I was invited to present online to medical students, and I was the only non-doctor, or as in the only person who hadn't had their doctorate or wasn't a senior academic at a university or a leading doctor in a hospital. And there were only 4 of us invited. And afterwards, one of the invited academics had contacted me. I know very well intentioned, but had actually said, "Oh, it's very surprising that you have so much knowledge for someone who is so young." And I wondered if that would have been said if I was white and male. And I'm curious about that, but I just had to take it in my stride and say, thank you for that, and just decide not to have anything to do with that particular academic going forward. So it is really interesting. A lot of these things aren't obvious, and that's the thing that really sits with me in a really uncomfortable way, because they're not obvious, because they just kind of etch at you for years and years and years and years and years, and then all of a sudden it's like you look at the world in a different way and you just think, where is my place? And that's what I spent a lot of time doing last year, processing. And the article was a really, incredible way to share that.
Sounds almost cathartic in
Yeah,
some
very
ways.
cathartic.
And what
Yeah.
what I'm hearing is that um, for that there's it's like a bubbling of experiences
Mm,
of little pricks, and I remember
mm,
seeing about microaggressions, a video comparing it to mosquito
yeah.
bites,
Mm,
and sometimes the itch is there and you don't realize what happened, and
mm.
then days, sometimes years later, an uncovering happens of where that is, and it feels like it's an ongoing process. It's just not a one-time event, but a long-term impact of moments that build over time. And yeah,
And that worthiness as well. Like, my parents have always brought us up thinking that we could do anything in the world, which is the most incredible way to be brought up, I think. And, to get into context and just have those moments of like, oh, maybe I can't do that, or oh, maybe I can't do that. But then coming back to my parents saying, you can do anything in the world, and trying to hold on to that, but then that kind of almost feeling a bit disconnected from some of the experiences. So it
yeah.
is, yeah, it's quite interesting.
So
Yeah, and I've learned also as the conference convener, we were working really hard with people who experience adversity, or specifically people who identify as having a disability, to make sure that the conference itself was accessible, and in working with this collective of incredible Australian music therapists who identify as having disability, we learned so much, and it was all about that connection, as well. As you said, I've experienced adversity in a different way. I don't identify as having a disability, but then linking in different with different people who have different experiences, just to extend our knowledge, it was so significant. And then the feedback was really, yeah, heartwarming, and it made the whole year and the whole struggle of the year completely and utterly worth it, just so people could be heard. And I think as well with the article, another kind of intention that was always there was, when I finished it, which it feels quite empowering to say this out loud. When I finished it, I remember thinking to myself, wow, I wish I had this to read as a music therapy student. Like, I wish someone told me this is what it could be like, and that's okay. And that was another part of it that I hope that it gets used, it gets passed around for music therapy students, so they know that when you finish, it isn't just all peaches and cream. It's different for different people. So that was something that was, I feel like out of everything I've ever done, it's my most proud piece of writing, I think.
something else that stood out to me was oftentimes, talking about intersectionality or talking about microaggressions and in relation to healthcare or relation to other educational settings, usually it's considered, you know, critical discourse, or it's considered disability
Mm,
studies, or it's considered. Um, Rarely do you see it within the context of medical work,
mm,
and so it seems to be significant too that the work that you're advocating for with stroke rehabilitation, and that this discourse is happening also within that context, because rarely
mm.
have I necessarily seen it within medical music therapy or medical perspectives, the worlds meet. Is that something that you're considering in terms of how these worlds have merged for you?
Yeah, and I think it took somebody else to actually articulate that to me before I actually spent some time reflecting upon it. Because to me, it's I mean, there's no question about it that you can't separate
Right.
you can't separate these things. Like, they
Right.
exist. I don't understand how you could compartmentalize that, and also to
Right.
perhaps compartmentalize and separate probably comes from a position of privilege. So it took somebody else to articulate that to me for me to reflect. And I think in the context of the medical world, this happens all the time, and
Yep.
it just takes, I think perhaps it takes people who have experienced adversity to know maybe that something isn't quite
Right.
right, but maybe not know how to articulate it, because that's how I felt for, well, up until writing this article. Like, something didn't feel right. I really wanted to work with these stroke survivors because they were getting overlooked, and everyone would ask me, you're so passionate about stroke rehabilitation, do you know someone who's had a stroke? Do you have a personal experience? And I don't. And I just never understood where that drive came from. And
Interesting.
I thought,
Yeah.
why am I so passionate about it? And why in the medical acute context? So I'm also
Interesting.
quite, yeah, I'm also quite a numbers person. I'm quite quantitative in my thinking, but for my research, I'm doing a mixed methods project. And because this is a new intervention that I've created for my PhD, I wanted to learn about the experience of the treatment that the people have received. So whether that's just the usual treatment or usual treatment plus the music therapy intervention on top of it. And I just wanted to learn more and more about what it was like, and so bridging that kind of, getting the numerical data, because I'm going to have to prove something to the medical world, but then still saying, no, this is a mixed method study, so we need to amplify the voices of these survivors in both groups, and find out what it's actually like. And interestingly, I found in the past couple of years that there has been more presented qualitative research in stroke and rehab conferences in, again, the Australian context, versus years ago it was only quantitative. So I think the whole medical world is moving more towards voice and listening to the lived experience of people. And on that kind of, I guess, that note of lived experience, in a reflection of myself, I never really realized it was that valid, I suppose, because I don't even know that much about my history, because I didn't learn about it in school. I know more about not even Indigenous history in Australia, because in my generation we weren't even taught enough of that. We've all been kind of playing catch up with that as much as we can as adults. But I learned more about white settlement and the White Australia policy when I was in school. I didn't know anything about my heritage. I first learned that my surname, I mean, I kind of knew from my parents, but I learned about the Portuguese invasion of Goa when I was in year 8 in a history class. So, when you kind of, think about that, and really reflect upon, no, my unique experience is valid. It doesn't need to be written in a history book for it to be valid. And then you kind of reflect back on your clinical work. So me thinking about the context of stroke rehabilitation and trying to figure out, why do I want to make sure these survivors are heard? It is kind of, it's like a thread between us almost, just saying, just because this guideline says this is what works because of numbers, that doesn't mean as much to me as a clinician. I'm always a clinician before a researcher. That doesn't mean as much to me as the voices. So I guess that's something that I'm more able to articulate now, and it feels very empowering to be able to articulate it, because it was always there, but I just didn't know what it was.
And really, the generational harm of
Mm,
colonization that
yeah.
you've expressed here, in terms of also even going back to, putting different things in boxes, like, oh, this will be critical studies over here and this will be medical studies over here, feels to me a result of kind of very much a white colonial mindset of separating and boxing. And as you're eloquently describing this evening, is that there's a thread connecting all of this that's a really important to notice, in terms of research methodology, or in terms of
Mm.
scholarship, putting on conferences, clinical work that you're doing, that once this door is open, it's you can't close it. You're in it within all areas. You're in the room now. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. In the
Is there
room, that's very powerful.
Yeah.
It's very powerful to feel like that now. But I have to also share that to other people who have, maybe had similar processes to myself with
Right.
especially the year that has been, it's been exhausting. Like I took a solid couple of weeks off at the beginning of this year, but it's been emotionally exhausting. Like just, it's felt like quite a struggle as well, because when you learn more, you want to do more, which is incredible. But you also have to be kind to yourself. And I guess maybe speaking to other people who have similar experiences to me and who want to make sure that the others are heard, I've had to very uncomfortably make sure that I kind of sit back and just focus on myself for a little bit of time, because I was exhausted, yeah, after that.
Provide yourself some boundaries at the same time.
Yeah, yeah. So I've got
Yeah.
some pretty clear boundaries for myself now. That last year was quite a big year, especially with advocacy stuff for
Yeah.
me, and processing. It's all kind of interconnected, but just having those boundaries for myself for the moment, just to finish off the PhD, even, just to get to that finish line, and then start thinking about what I would like to do next with all this kind of these emotions and these feelings and these thoughts and knowledge.
Is there anything that we haven't touched upon this evening that you feel um, might be missing before we say goodbye?
Um, no, I don't think so. I think, it's just been really great to, I guess, have a conversation about this, and perhaps for other people who have been through similar processes to perhaps find something in that piece or in this conversation reflected um, for them. Because I know when I read pieces of writing like this, not like this, sorry, when I read pieces of writing that kind of articulate how I've been feeling, I find it quite validating. And for people who have read the article and who have reached out and told me that it was validating for them, I'm really so grateful. And that's the most I could have hoped to have gotten out
Yeah,
of just sharing. So thank you for writing and
absolutely.
taking the time.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for the vulnerability you've put out in writing this article, and for sharing the wonderful room that you are in now, the interconnectedness, and yeah, we look forward to hearing more in the future.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, everybody, for watching. A link to Tanya Silveira's article is in the description. We appreciate you watching these Voices interviews. And if you have any comments or questions, you can contact me, Michael Viega, Communication Editor for Voices. My email is in the description as well. Take care now.